The stagecoach jolted to a stop, sending up a cloud of dust that clung to Clara Whitaker's travel-worn dress. Her gloved hands trembled as she clutched her small trunk, the only thing left that was truly hers. When the driver opened the door and tipped his hat, she forced a polite smile and stepped down onto the hard-packed earth of Willow Creek. The sun was dipping low, throwing long shadows across the dirt road that cut through the tiny western town. It wasn't her first time there, but it was the first time she had no idea where to go. 3 weeks earlier, she had arrived in this same town full of quiet hope. She had answered a mail-order ad placed by a merchant named Mr. Dawson, a man who promised security, companionship, and a Christian home. At 32, Clara had thought her chance at marriage was long gone, but his letters had been kind, even affectionate. He'd written that he wanted a mature woman, with a gentle nature, and she had believed him until she stepped off the stagecoach and saw the disappointment in his eyes. "You look older than your photograph," he'd said flatly. His gaze had lingered on the faint lines near her eyes, the sun-faded brown hair pinned neatly beneath her hat. "I was expecting someone younger." 3 days later, without ceremony or farewell, he sent her back on the next stagecoach. No payment, no help, just humiliation and whispers from the townsfolk who saw her return alone. Now, as she stood by the stagecoach station once more, her heart felt heavier than the trunk she set beside her. The driver tipped his hat again before climbing back aboard, leaving her in the settling dusk. Around her, the town bustled with the ordinary rhythm of life. Men laughing outside the saloon, women hurrying home with baskets, a dog barking in the distance. No one looked at her directly, but she could feel their eyes anyway. The returned bride. The woman who wasn't wanted. She sat on the bench outside the telegraph office, clutching her coat tighter against the chill. She could have wired her brother back east, but pride stopped her. He had warned her not to trust a stranger's promise. He would only pity her now. "Ma'am?" The voice was deep, calm, and startlingly gentle. Clara looked up and saw a man standing a few feet away, a tall figure in a weathered brown coat, his hat pulled low, the lines of his face softened by twilight. She recognized him vaguely from the church gathering she'd attended the week before her ill-fated marriage. Eli Turner, the widowed rancher who rarely spoke more than a few words to anyone. "You look like you've had a rough journey," he said quietly. "I'm fine," she lied, rising to her feet. "Just waiting to decide what comes next." Eli studied her for a moment, not with pity but with something steadier, understanding. "You got a place to stay?" She hesitated. "No, but I'll find one," he nodded slowly. "My ranch has a spare room. You're welcome to it, at least till you figure things out." The offer caught her off guard. "I couldn't impose." "You wouldn't be," he said simply. "It's a big house. Quiet." She searched his face for any trace of judgment or hidden motive but found none. Just sincerity and the kind of quiet strength she hadn't seen in anyone for a long time. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The sky turned gold, then violet. Clara finally exhaled and nodded once. "Just for a few days, then." Eli tipped his hat. "That'll do." As he lifted her trunk with ease and led the way toward his horse-drawn wagon, Clara looked back at the town one last time. The whispers would follow her, she knew, but for the first time since her rejection, the weight on her heart eased. Just a little. Maybe, she thought, this wasn't the end after all. Maybe it was the beginning of something she couldn't yet name. The wagon creaked along the dirt road as the lights of Willow Creek faded behind them. Clara sat quietly beside Eli Turner, her gloved hands folded tightly in her lap. The silence stretched between them, but it wasn't uncomfortable, just unfamiliar. She wasn't used to kindness that didn't come with questions or expectations. Eli guided the horses with an easy hand, his gaze fixed on the winding road ahead. The sky above them deepened into indigo, stars beginning to blink awake. After several long minutes, he said softly, "You don't have to talk, but if you want to, sometimes it helps." Clara shook her head. "There's not much to say." He didn't press. He simply nodded as though he understood the kind of hurt that didn't need words. When they reached his ranch, she was surprised by its quiet beauty. The house stood tall and solid at the edge of rolling hills, its white paint faded by years of wind and sun. The smell of hay and horses drifted in the cool air, mingling with the faint scent of lilac from the bushes near the porch. Everything about the place felt lived in, steady but lonely. Eli helped her down from the wagon, lifting her trunk with one hand as though it weighed nothing. "You'll stay in the room at the back," he said. "It gets the morning light." Clara followed him inside, taking in the simple but tidy home, the worn wooden floors, the soft crackle of the fire, the faint ticking of a wall clock. She noticed the absence, too. No feminine touches, no laughter, no presence beyond his. "I used to keep a housekeeper," he said, as if reading her thoughts. "She left to marry a ranch hand over in Silverton. Haven't bothered to find another." Clara set her gloves on the table. "You live alone, then?" He nodded. "Just me and the land. Suits me fine most days." Something in his tone hinted that it didn't always suit him as well as he claimed. She hesitated, unsure how to repay his hospitality. "I can earn my keep," she offered. "I can cook, sew, tend the garden, whatever needs doing." Eli smiled faintly, the first she'd seen from him. "You don't owe me anything, Miss Whitaker. You're a guest, not a hired hand." Still, the next morning, Clara rose before dawn and found her way to the kitchen. She kneaded dough with practiced hands, stirred eggs, and set out coffee by the time Eli came in from the barn. His hair was damp with sweat, his shirt sleeves rolled to his elbows. When he saw the breakfast laid out, he paused in the doorway. "You didn't have to—" "I wanted to," she interrupted gently. "It feels good to do something again." He took a seat, and for the first time they shared a meal in companionable silence. The clink of cutlery, the hiss of the stove, and the chirp of morning birds filled the air. Over the next days, an easy rhythm began to form. Clara mended torn shirts, helped feed the animals, and tended to the small patch of flowers by the porch. Eli never hovered, never treated her like a burden. When he spoke, it was with the calm certainty of a man who valued silence as much as words. One evening, as the sun melted into the horizon, Clara found him repairing a fence. She brought him a glass of water, their fingers brushing as he took it. "You've brought life back to this place," he said quietly. She blinked, startled. "I've only been here a few days." He met her gaze, steady and unflinching. "Sometimes that's all it takes." Clara turned away quickly, her heart thudding in her chest. She wasn't sure if it was gratitude or something deeper, but for the first time in years, she felt seen. Not as a burden, not as a mistake, but as someone who mattered. That night, as she sat by the window in her small room, the wind rustling the curtains, Clara realized something had shifted. She had come to Eli's ranch as a woman cast aside, stripped of pride and purpose. But here, under his quiet kindness and the vast western sky, she began to feel something she hadn't in a very long time: hope. The days at Eli Turner's ranch began to unfold with a quiet, comforting rhythm. Morning sunlight streamed through Clara's window, painting the simple room in gold. The scent of coffee drifted from the kitchen, mingling with the crisp air that carried the sound of roosters crowing in the distance. Clara had never known peace like this, steady, honest, and without demand. There were no letters to answer, no expectations to meet, no shame chasing her footsteps. Only work to be done, and a man whose presence felt as grounding as the land itself. Each morning she joined Eli in the chores, feeding the chickens, hanging laundry, tending the garden, or sweeping the wide porch. He never hovered, never corrected her, never treated her like a charity case. When she asked where to find things, he'd simply point or nod, offering a small smile that spoke more than words ever could. At first, they spoke little. But as the weeks passed, small conversations began to fill the quiet. She learned that Eli had been widowed for nearly 6 years. His wife Anna had died during a harsh winter, leaving him alone with the ranch and his grief. Since then, he'd buried himself in work, speaking to few and trusting fewer. One afternoon, as they repaired a section of the barn roof, Clara looked down at him from the ladder and said softly, "You must have loved her very much." Eli paused, hammer in hand, then nodded. "I did." She was the kind of woman who could make a home out of dust and silence. Clara's throat tightened. "And now?" He looked up at her then, his eyes calm but full of unspoken sorrow. "Now I just keep the home standing." For a moment neither of them spoke. Then Clara returned to her work, her hands trembling slightly. She knew something about loss, the kind that left you half alive. In the evenings, after supper, they would sit on the porch, The sky stretched wide and endless above them, streaked with pink and orange. Sometimes Eli would tell her stories about his ranching days, broken wagons, stubborn horses, the flood that once nearly washed the place away. Clara would listen, smiling softly, and sometimes laugh, a sound that startled even her. "Nice to hear laughter around here again," Eli said one night. Glancing at her from the corner of his eye, she blushed. "I didn't realize I'd forgotten how." He gave a small, knowing nod. "Happens to all of us." The silence that followed was warm, not awkward. Clara found herself studying him when he wasn't looking. The strong lines of his face, the calloused hands that somehow handled everything with care, the deep steadiness in his voice when he spoke her name. And slowly, the ache that had followed her from town to town began to fade. She found beauty in small things, the way the wind whispered through the grass, the laughter of a calf learning to stand, the scent of wild sage after a rainstorm, and always Eli, his presence like an anchor, steady and kind, even when he said little. One Sunday morning, she stood outside hanging laundry when she caught sight of him watching her from the corral. He looked different in the sunlight, softened somehow, younger. When their eyes met, something unspoken passed between them. She turned away quickly, her cheeks warm, but her heart felt light in a way she hadn't known was possible. That night, as she lay awake, Clara realized that Willow Creek no longer haunted her dreams. The humiliation, the rejection, the sting of cruel words, all of it was slowly being replaced by something gentler. Eli hadn't offered her grand promises. He hadn't tried to fix her. He had simply given her space to breathe, to remember who she was before the world told her she wasn't enough. And in that quiet, among the rolling hills and golden fields, Clara began to heal. The peace that had settled over Clara's days was fragile, like the thin frost that melted with the first touch of morning sun. She had grown used to the rhythm of the ranch, the steady sound of Eli's boots on the porch, the whinny of horses at dawn, the smell of baking bread and coffee that filled the kitchen each morning. For a while, she almost forgot that she was a woman whispered about in town, a bride who had been sent away in disgrace. But Willow Creek hadn't forgotten her. It began when Eli took her into town for supplies. Clara had insisted on coming along, wanting to prove she wasn't hiding from anyone. She wore her best dress, the one she'd mended carefully, and pinned her hair neatly beneath her hat. For a brief moment, she almost felt like the woman she used to be, hopeful, unashamed. But as soon as they entered the general store, conversation hushed. Two women near the shelves turned to look at her, whispering behind their hands. One of them, Mrs. Hallbrook, the wife of a local merchant, smirked. "Well, if it isn't the bride who got returned to sender." The words struck like a slap. Clara froze, her hands tightening on the basket she held. Eli, who had been selecting rope, looked up at the sound, but said nothing yet. Mrs. Hallbrook continued, her voice sweet but sharp. "Didn't realize you'd found new lodging so soon. A widower's ranch, no less." Laughter followed, quiet, mean, and cutting. Clara's cheeks burned hot, her throat tight. "Come, Eli," she murmured. "Let's just—" But Eli set down the coil of rope and turned toward the women. His expression was calm, but his voice held steel. "Mrs. Hallbrook, I reckon my guests are my concern. If you've got business, tend to it. If not, maybe you'd best keep your tongue still." The room went silent. Mrs. Hallbrook's smile faltered. Eli's tone wasn't loud, but there was something about it, firm, unyielding, that silenced every whisper in the store. Still, the humiliation clung to Clara long after they left town. On the ride home, she stared out at the endless sweep of prairie, her hands clenched in her lap. "They'll never see me as anything else," she said quietly. A woman too old, too unwanted, too desperate. Eli didn't look at her right away. "You're letting other folks decide your worth, Clara. That's a mistake." "You don't understand," she said, her voice trembling. "You've never been cast aside. You've never been told you're not enough." Eli's jaw tightened. "I buried my wife and lived years believing nothing could grow again. Not in me, not on this land. I know what it means to feel like nothing's left." His words sank into her like the first drop of rain after a drought. She turned toward him, but he was already looking ahead, guiding the horses with quiet focus. That night, Clara couldn't sleep. Shame, anger, and confusion tangled inside her chest. She rose before dawn, packed her few belongings, and crept down the hall. She couldn't bear the thought of ruining Eli's reputation, of giving those gossiping tongues something more to feast on. When she reached the porch, a lantern flickered behind her. "You're leaving." Eli's voice was calm, but the hurt in it stopped her cold. She turned, clutching her trunk. "It's better this way. They're already talking. I don't want to bring you shame." He stepped closer, the light catching the lines of his face. "You think I care what they say?" "You should," she whispered. "You've been kind to me. I won't have people twisting that into something else." For a moment he said nothing. Then, softly, "Why do you believe what they say matters more than what I see in you?" The question hit her harder than any insult could have. She opened her mouth to answer, but no words came. Eli stepped aside, giving her space. "If you have to go, I won't stop you. But don't go because of them. Go because it's what you want." Clara hesitated, torn between fear and something deeper, something that felt dangerously close to hope. But old wounds ran deep. She lowered her gaze. "I'm sorry," she whispered, and then she walked out into the dawn, not daring to look back. The sky had begun to darken long before Clara noticed. Clouds rolled in from the west, heavy and gray, as if the heavens themselves were warning her to turn back. But she didn't. Her small wagon rattled over the uneven trail, her hands gripping the reins tightly. She had borrowed Eli's old mare without asking, just until she reached the next town, she told herself. She'd leave a note, send payment later, find work somewhere new. Anywhere but Willow Creek. Anywhere but near the man who had looked at her as if she were worth something when she knew she wasn't. Wind swept across the plains, cold and biting. A distant rumble of thunder echoed, low and threatening. Clara pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders. She could barely see the road now, and every instinct in her urged her to turn around. But pride and shame are powerful masters, and she obeyed them still. By the time the first drops of rain began to fall, she was already lost. The storm came fast. Lightning split the sky, thunder shook the earth, and sheets of rain pounded against her back. The horse whinnied in fear, stumbling as mud swallowed its hooves. Clara tried to steady it, shouting over the roar of the wind, but the wagon lurched violently, snapping a wheel and throwing her to the ground. She hit hard, pain shooting through her shoulder. For a moment, the world spun in a blur of rain and darkness. When she tried to stand, her legs trembled, the cold seeping into her bones. She spotted a small barn through the downpour, a dark shape against the hillside. Half crawling, half running, she reached it, pushing open the creaking door just as the sky split with lightning again. Inside, it was dim and empty except for a few old hay bales and the scent of dust and damp wood. Clara collapsed in the corner, her soaked dress clinging to her skin. The thunder grew distant, but the cold did not. She shivered violently, whispering to herself just to keep from crying. "What have I done?" She thought of Eli, how he'd looked at her with such calm steadiness, how he'd said she mattered, how he hadn't flinched from the whispers. And she thought of his last words, "Don't go because of them. Go because it's what you want." Tears slipped down her cheeks, mingling with the rain. She realized then that she hadn't left because of what others said. She had left because she didn't believe she deserved the peace he offered. Outside, through the curtain of rain, the sound of hooves echoed faintly. Clara froze, certain she was imagining it. But the sound grew louder, closer, steady, purposeful. Then a beam of lantern light swept across the barn door. "Clara!" Her heart leapt. She recognized that voice anywhere. The door banged open, wind and rain rushing in with Eli Turner himself, coat soaked, hat dripping, eyes full of worry and relief. He spotted her instantly and strode across the barn, kneeling beside her. "You're freezing," he said, his voice tight with concern. He shrugged off his coat and wrapped it around her shoulders before she could protest. "I told you not to come," she whispered, her voice breaking. He looked at her then, his gaze unwavering. "You can run from the town, Clara, but don't run from me." Something inside her cracked, something she had been holding shut for years. She pressed a trembling hand to his chest, feeling the steady beat of his heart beneath her fingers. "Why did you come?" "Because you belong with me," he said simply. "And I couldn't let you disappear thinking you don't." The storm raged around them, but inside that old barn, Clara felt a stillness settle in her heart. For the first time, she wasn't alone. For the first time, she wasn't unwanted. When the rain finally began to fade, Eli helped her to her feet. His arm was strong around her shoulders as he led her to his horse. The night air was cold, but his warmth was steady, grounding. As they rode back toward the ranch through the soft patter of the dying storm, Clara rested her head lightly against his shoulder. She didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but she knew one thing for certain. She wasn't running anymore. By the time they reached the ranch, dawn was breaking over the hills, soft pink light spilling across the wet earth. The storm had passed, leaving behind the scent of rain and the hush that always followed such fury. Clara was exhausted, body and soul, but the moment Eli lifted her down from the saddle, she felt something unspoken settle between them. Steady as the rising sun, he guided her inside, his hand gentle against her back. The fire still glowed faintly in the hearth, and he knelt to stoke it until the flames came alive again. Clara sat in the old wooden chair, wrapped in his coat, watching him in silence. The warmth crept slowly back into her fingers, but her heart was another matter. Uneasy, uncertain, afraid to hope. Eli poured her a cup of coffee, pressing it into her hands. "You could have died out there," he said quietly. His voice was rough, not angry, but filled with something heavier. "You shouldn't have been alone." Clara lowered her eyes. "I didn't mean to cause trouble. I just couldn't bear the looks, the whispers. You've already done too much for me." He crouched beside her, resting one arm on his knee. "Clara, listen to me. I don't care what they say in town. I never did. You think kindness is trouble? You think having someone here who makes this place feel alive again is a burden?" His words hit her like a rush of wind, stirring everything she had tried to bury. "Eli," she hesitated, her throat tightening. "I'm not young or beautiful or what a man like you deserves. I'm just what's left." Eli's gaze softened. He reached for her hand, his rough fingers wrapping gently around hers. "You think I'm looking for what's young or perfect?" he asked. "I've seen beauty fade, Clara. I've watched the strongest things in this world break. But I've also seen what endures, the kind of heart that doesn't quit, even after being hurt. That's you." Tears welled in her eyes. "You don't mean that," he smiled faintly. "You think I don't know my own mind? You've been here long enough to see I don't waste words." Clara laughed softly through her tears, shaking her head. "You hardly use them at all." "Then listen close," he said, "because I'm only going to say this once." He took a slow breath as if steadying himself. "You came to this ranch broken, thinking you'd been thrown away. But since you walked through that door, there's been light in this house again. You cook, you laugh, you make this place feel like home. You make me feel like home." Clara's lips parted, but no sound came. Eli continued, his voice low and certain. "I've spent years waiting for something I didn't think I'd find again. For peace, for purpose, for someone who understands silence the way I do. Clara Whitaker, you're exactly what I was waiting for." Her breath caught, the words sinking deep into the cracks of her heart like rain into dry soil. No one had ever said such things to her, not as truth, not without expectation. "Eli," she whispered. "Are you asking?" He smiled, just barely. "I'm not good with grand speeches. But if you'll have me, if you'll stay, I'd be proud to call you my wife." The world seemed to still. The crackle of the fire, the morning wind against the windows, even her own heartbeat, all faded into a quiet she could only describe as grace. Clara reached up, touching his face gently. "You don't have to save me," she murmured. "I'm not trying to," he said. "You already saved me." Tears slid down her cheeks, but this time they weren't from pain. They were from the overwhelming warmth that filled her, soft, certain, and new. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, Eli Turner. I'll stay." Eli let out a breath that trembled with relief and joy. He drew her into his arms, and she didn't resist. For the first time in years, Clara felt completely seen, not as a rejected bride or a woman past her prime, but as someone worthy of love. Outside, the morning sun broke fully over the hills, flooding the ranch in gold. Inside, two souls, once lonely, once lost, found the beginning of forever. The days that followed Eli's proposal were quiet, but filled with a new kind of energy. Clara no longer moved through the ranch with the cautious hesitance of someone who expected to be unwelcome. She walked with purpose, her heart lighter, her steps steadier. And Eli noticed it too, how she smiled more freely, laughed more easily, how her presence seemed to bring life back to every corner of the house. They fell into a rhythm together. Mornings were spent tending the animals and the land, afternoons repairing fences or mending clothes, and evenings sitting on the porch, watching the sun dip behind the hills. Clara found joy in simple routines, kneading bread, brushing the horses' coats, planting flowers in the garden. And Eli, for the first time in years, allowed himself to be quietly proud of the life they were building together. The townsfolk of Willow Creek noticed the change too. At first, their whispers were hesitant, filled with curiosity. Some were skeptical, their judgment slow to fade. But when they saw Clara riding alongside Eli, working beside him, laughing easily without fear or shame, opinions shifted. Respect replaced doubt and slowly admiration. The woman they had once mocked was now part of a partnership that no one could ignore. One afternoon, Clara found herself teaching a small group of orphan girls who lived near the outskirts of town. She had been reluctant at first, unsure of her place in the community, but her natural warmth and patience quickly won the children over. Eli watched from a distance, leaning against the fence with a proud smile, seeing not only the woman he loved, but also the impact she had on the world around her. The ranch itself seemed to thrive in ways it hadn't in years. Crops grew stronger, the animals were healthier, and the buildings, once quiet and cold, felt alive with laughter, conversation, and the rhythm of shared life. Clara and Eli worked side by side, each complementing the other in a way that felt effortless. Where he was steady and practical, she was gentle and creative. Where she hesitated, he encouraged. Where he doubted, she believed. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sun sink into the horizon, Eli reached for Clara's hand. She intertwined her fingers with his, feeling the warmth and strength in his touch. "You know," he said quietly, "I used to think this place would always be lonely, that I'd never find someone who could make it feel like home again." Clara leaned her head against his shoulder. "And now?" "Now," he said, "I can't imagine life without you. Not just in this house, but in every corner of it. You've brought it alive." "You've brought me alive," Clara smiled, tears glinting in her eyes. I think I'm finally home." The realization washed over her like a gentle wave. She had arrived at the ranch a woman cast aside, humiliated, unsure of her worth. Now she was loved, respected, and cherished, not for youth or beauty, but for her courage, her heart, and her unwavering spirit. Together, they planned for the future, not in grand, impossible schemes, but in quiet moments of shared dreams. They talked of planting more gardens, expanding the barn, even someday taking in more children from the town to care for. Life was no longer about surviving shame or proving worth. It was about building, nurturing, and loving in a place where they belonged. And every evening, as the stars blinked awake over the rolling hills, Clara and Eli would sit on the porch hand in hand, letting the silence speak what words could not. The past no longer held her captive. The whispers of the town could no longer touch her heart. Here, on this ranch, with Eli beside her, Clara had found not only a home, but a new beginning, a life filled with hope, love, and the quiet certainty that they would face whatever came next, together. Years passed, and the ranch flourished under the steady hands and hearts of Eli and Clara. The rolling hills, once quiet and lonely, now buzzed with life, the clatter of horses' hooves, the soft coo of chickens, the laughter of children playing near the garden. Clara had long ago ceased to be the woman who arrived in Willow Creek broken and rejected. She had grown into a figure of strength, warmth, and quiet authority, loved by the community and adored by Eli. Each morning she rose with the sun, tending the garden that had become her pride. Tomatoes, herbs, and bright flowers spilled from the earth, a reflection of the life she nurtured not only on the land, but in everyone around her. Eli would join her when chores allowed, a hat on his head, sleeves rolled up, and that familiar calm steadiness in his eyes. Together they moved in harmony, their laughter and small, teasing words filling the air like music. Clara had begun teaching local children to read and sew, often inviting them into the ranch kitchen, where lessons and life skills merged. The orphan girls she had once worried about caring for thrived under her guidance, their shy smiles and laughter a balm to her own heart. Eli watched quietly, tending to the animals or repairing fences, and often caught himself smiling without realizing it. Their home was not perfect, but it was filled with a love that made imperfections irrelevant. The townsfolk had grown to respect the couple as much for their character as for their hard work. Willow Creek whispered less and admired more. Clara's past humiliation was no longer a defining mark. It was a distant memory, replaced by the undeniable truth that she had carved a life of dignity, love, and purpose. One golden evening, Clara and Eli stood on the porch, watching the sun melt into the horizon. The air was warm with the lingering touch of day, fragrant with wildflowers and the promise of harvest. Eli took Clara's hand in his, squeezing gently. "You ever think about that first day you arrived here?" he asked. Clara smiled softly, recalling the shyness, the fear, the humiliation. "I was so sure I'd never find my place. And now?" "Now," she said, resting her head against his shoulder, "I know exactly where I belong." He kissed the top of her hair, the comfort and love of that simple gesture speaking volumes. "You've made this place home. You've made me whole again." The two of them stood there in silence for a while, the soft whisper of wind through the fields their only companion. It was in these quiet moments that they understood what they had built, not a grand palace or a perfect life, but a sanctuary of love, trust, and resilience. As the stars began to dot the night sky, Clara reflected on the journey that had brought her here, the rejection, the shame, the long road of uncertainty. She thought of every whispered insult in the town, every moment she had questioned her worth. And now she knew that all of it had led her to Eli Turner, to the ranch, and to a life more beautiful than she had ever dared imagine. When asked how they met, she often smiled and said, "I was sent away in shame, but that's how I found where I truly belonged." And in her voice, there was no bitterness, only gratitude and a quiet joy. Together, Clara and Eli faced each day, hand in hand, hearts entwined, knowing that the love they shared was enduring, real, and steadfast. The ranch thrived, the children flourished, and the two of them had built something unshakable, a home, a life, and a love that would weather every storm. As the night settled over the hills, the ranch stood bathed in moonlight. Inside, the couple sat by the fire, quiet but complete, their hearts aligned with the peace and promise of the life they had made together. The past was behind them, the future wide open, and in each other, they had found the home they had both been waiting for.